suppose the one thing I can say about the whole mess is that the guy did try to warn me. The garage sale was fairly large. Piles of random and completely unrelated items scattered across several tables, with boxes and crates full of assorted items dumped haphazardly in front. As soon as I lifted that awful thing up and out of the shabby cardboard box it had been placed into, I knew there was something wrong about it, not least because of the way that the owner, the guy running the garage sale and whose stuff for sale I was rummaging through, reacted to me picking it up. Seeing the thing in my hands, he immediately lunged forwards toward me, as if I had just grabbed onto a live snake and pulled it out by its tail, or put my hand into the box only to draw out a loaded gun. "Careful with that!" he shouted. "Careful!" My first reaction was to step back from the table, put the thing straight back into the box, and hold my hands up. I didn't want the guy saying that I damaged something then trying to make me pay for it, so I made it clear that I had only touched it for a second. I'll admit, even then, part of me was wondering why he was so protective over something he had just stuffed into a cardboard box on the sidewalk. As it turned out, it wasn't the object he was trying to protect, it was me. By the time he came to my side, the guy was already apologizing. "I'm sorry, it's just, that's a very delicate item and, well, it has to be handled in a very specific way." I looked from the man's kind-looking face and back to the ugly little item in the box and decided that despite the guy's weird outburst, I was interested in hearing more about it. For me, as an antiques collector, the only thing more exciting than a curious object is one with a good story behind it. The object in question was a small rectangular box, something like the more ornate cigar boxes you see knocking around, only quite a bit larger at around 10 inches long. It was made from what looked like polished or lacquered cherry wood, and the top surface was completely glass. On one side there were brass hinges, and on the other, a small ornate keyhole, the key for which was attached to the top of the case by a minuscule brass buckle. Inside the case was a full, perfectly proportioned but absolutely tiny human skeleton. The body could not have been more than 8 inches long. At first glance, I thought the thing was distasteful, a relic from some medical exhibit of a child, or rather a very young infant's preserved skeleton. Looking at it more closely, however, I realized that it was nothing of the sort. The skull and eye sockets were not large as they would be on a child, but were instead in the proportions of a fully grown adult. The bones of the skull were fused, something that marked it as an older specimen, not to mention the full set of teeth prominently on display marking this as an adult. From what I could see, this appeared to be an impossibly small skeleton of a fully grown adult human, which meant either that it was an incredible medical marvel or a clever sculpture made from the bones of rats, chickens, and monkeys with fish bones for the more delicate pieces, and formed the appearance of a human. Either way, it was a fascinating object, and one that I was tempted to purchase even before I heard the backstory. "I can sell this one on to you," the owner assured me, glancing over my shoulder at some other potential garage sale customers, a couple who were shuffling through some vinyl records, and an old woman who was looking longingly at a porcelain ornament of a dog. "But you have to promise, if you take it with you, that you will stick to the rules." By the time he had finished that sentence, I already knew I was going to be leaving with this item, no matter the price. The story alone was enough to sell it to me. "This here," the guy said, "is the skeleton of Jack Minton. He was a sailor in the 19th century, but sometime around 1875, he managed to offend the wrong old lady. Some say a Norwegian witch, others a hoodoo priestess. I'm not entirely sure who she was or what he did to offend her, but she cursed him to shrink and decrease in stature, shrinking by a certain amount every month until he apologized. The problem was, not only that Jack Minton, a very stubborn man who refused to apologize, and a sailor who left the place where the woman lived days after offending her, but 2 months after the curse was cast, the old lady died, meaning that the old Jack had no chance to apologize. Believe me, he tried. In the months that followed, he went to her grave every day and tried to apologize on his hands and knees, but nobody was there to hear the words or lift the curse, so he continued to shrink. Eventually he became so small that his organs were cramped, and he passed away in agony, but his body continued to shrink. When it finally stopped shrinking, his fellow sailors took his skeleton and placed it in this box. My father picked it up in a curiosity shop in Zanzibar in the 1960s. It's yours if you want it, but you must promise me to never ever open the box. Curses must remain sealed up or they can spread. The deal was as good as done. For what I considered a very small fee, I acquired this exciting conversation piece and was already dreaming about how best to advertise it for eventual sale. At length, I decided that to increase its market value, I would need to hire a historian or researcher to see if they could dig out any record of this Jack Minton or any legends associated with the tiny skeleton. I eventually settled on a guy named Cliff. For a month or two, everything went perfectly. Cliff presented me some really interesting research, and I began to suspect that this item would fetch a pretty good sum at auction. But then, Cliff broke the rules. I came into my study one day to find him, with the glass case open and using tweezers to adjust the position of the figure's arms. He explained that he had been examining it, but could tell from my reaction that I was less than happy. At the time, I was not a particularly superstitious man, but I do believe in listening to people when they give you fair warning. Nowadays, I take warnings even more seriously, and I have become far more superstitious. They called it something like acute accelerated general osteoporosis, though I might have gotten the title completely wrong. Whatever the accurate medical term, the end result was precisely the same. Over the next 3 weeks, Cliff began complaining of painful aches in his joints, particularly the bones of his hands and feet. Then it spread to his legs and back, and the pain continued to increase. Visiting the doctor, he was prescribed painkillers pending an X-ray to confirm or rule out rheumatoid arthritis. By the time he went back to the doctor, however, Cliff had shrunk by almost an inch. I took the box back to the house, where the garage sale had been, and when the owner refused to take the thing back, I threw it off the bridge and into the river, feeling that a water burial was probably more fitting for a sailor than being kept in a box. Doing this, however, did not stop the shrinking. Last I heard, Cliff had shrunk by almost 9 inches. The most curious thing, however, is that it isn't just in height that he's getting smaller. His skin has become loose, and now dangles and sags down in large sheet-like folds, as if he had lost a lot of weight suddenly. The flesh of his hands looks like he is wearing gloves. The loose skin is a result of his rare and painful condition. His bones, and just the bones, are shrinking within the skin, whilst the rest of the body, the muscles, the skin, the organs, remain the same size. The bones are decreasing in volume and length every month, little by little. The thing about garage sales is, you never know what you're going to find. It could be a rare record, a nostalgic childhood toy, the perfect gift for a relative, or a piece of clothing in exactly your size. Part of the excitement of sifting through the tables and boxes full of randomly collected junk is the idea that somewhere within that junk there might be a truly fantastic find. One man's trash, as they say, is another man's treasure. The problem with my special find, however, was that the things I brought home should have been thrown away, burnt or otherwise destroyed many years ago. For all our sakes, I've always been a sucker for anything that looks like old-school medical equipment. I love the old instruments, the measuring devices and the ampules used in old-time pharmacies, particularly if they come with slightly ornate packaging. So, when I saw the small leather satchel filled with tiny bottles, all with pristine labels handwritten in a beautifully calligraphic hand, I fell in love immediately. The woman running the garage sale told me that the small collection had belonged to a Dr. Steinlen, who was a medical doctor and a friend of the family. The kit bag, as she called it, would be used by him on house calls, and the 21 small bottles, each with an airtight, stoppered lid that were contained inside the bag, still had remnants of the chemicals and medicines he used to treat his patients. Some, she said, were medicines available at the time, others concoctions of his own invention. To me, the actual contents of the bottles was not particularly important. I would most likely open them up and swill away the remaining powders and liquids anyway. It was the way the entire thing looked that I loved, the leather bag, and the way that it folded out to allow easy access to the bottles, each of which had its own tiny strap to hold it in place within the lining of the bag. By the time I handed over the money and made my way back toward my car, I was already planning where I was going to display my latest purchase, in pride of place in my husband's study. As it turned out, I never made it that far with the item. Stopping at the store on the way home, I ran inside to pick up a few things, only to return and find that someone had picked up my car from the parking lot. The car was gone, along with my coat and my newest antique purchase. Naturally, I called the police, and after they arrived and I had made a report, I called an Uber to get me home, where I was exceptionally glad to be, not only because of my traumatic experience, but because I had begun to feel deeply unwell. Over the next 24 hours, my condition steadily worsened until I reached such a weakened state that I was unable to stand. My skin had come up in huge, itching swellings that pussed, and beneath my armpits and in my groin, from out of nowhere, huge swellings like immense black boils had appeared. My husband rushed me to hospital, and I was admitted immediately to an isolation unit. I am now listed as one of only a handful of patients ever to present with a case of bubonic plague in the history of the mainland United States medical system. Of particular interest to the doctors was the strain of the plague that I contracted, as it lacked the slight mutations and variations that are found in the modern disease, and more closely resembled the disease as it would have been many centuries earlier. Hearing this, I informed the staff about my purchase and asked if there might be some kind of link. Hearing the story, they became concerned and asked if I knew what was supposed to be contained in the other bottles. I said I didn't, but that I had a photograph of the case where they could read the labels. I had taken a snap on my phone to show my hubby what I'd bought. When the doctor saw it, his face went white. It turns out that this Dr. Steinlein was something of a myth in the medical community, a spook story that junior doctors told each other during training. He was known, so it is said, as a collector of pathogens and samples of various rare diseases, which he kept in an attempt to try and catalogue them. His initial aim was to create a repository or collection with examples of the bacteria or virus that he was studying. To that end, he kept samples from as many infected patients as possible in small glass jars in his lab. But he was low on record as one of the first people to suggest that knowledge of these diseases could have a military application if they could be artificially reproduced or grown. Amongst the labels on the bottles in my bag were almost a dozen diseases that have been either eradicated or are thought not to exist anymore outside of secure laboratories. In the wrong hands, those samples, I was told, could be very dangerous. We no longer have the antibodies in the population to deal with some of these diseases. If the sealed containers somehow still contain samples that could be infectious, then each one could be the equivalent of a chemical or biological weapon that could be used to spread untreatable diseases amongst a population. It was, they said, of the utmost importance that I tell them where the bag containing those bottles was at that precise moment. Of course, owing to the theft, that was a problem. I had no idea where the bag was, and I still don't. Nobody does. And that is a very worrying thought.